Having lots of self-confidence and taking pride in one's own achievements is certainly desirable. It gets a little tricky, however, if biases and fallacies are involved that we are not even aware of, such as the self-serving bias. Today we will find out about that one. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today I'd like to introduce you to another bias, the self-serving bias. So what is that one all about? First, I'd like to point out that the self-serving bias has a big family, so I need to give a bit of an introduction. It is an attribution bias. Attribution biases deal with observing other people's behaviors and attributing causes to it. We see other people doing things, we don't know why they do those things, so we come up with explanation. Now, the point is, if we fall victim to attribution errors, for example, the fundamental attribution error, which is basically the basic version, we tend to overemphasize internal factors such as the person's personality, and we underestimate external factors, outer circumstances. So let's say someone bumps into me on the street. Most likely, I won't think in the first moment, oh, this person is certainly in a hurry. They probably need to get somewhere quickly. They are probably stressed out, have an important appointment, whatever. But we will rather think, oh, this is quite an inconsiderate idiot. They probably have a bad personality. They have no good behavior. Now, basically, we would have to say, well, I don't know, both could be possible, but due to attribution biases, we tend to favor the internal explanation over the external factors one. Now, the self-serving bias is a member of this family of attribution biases, and it refers to situations that are about ourselves, that deal with ourselves, and situations where we experience success or failure. And it should be at least a bit meaningful, so it shouldn't be entirely meaningless, successes and failures. Now, what we like to do is we attribute our successes to our own merits. I succeeded because I'm so great, I'm so smart, I worked so hard, whatever. And our failures, we attribute to our circumstances. Oh, that was just bad luck. It was the fault of other people. It was bad circumstances. A popular example that is frequently used is a student who is writing tests. If the test turns out nicely, if they get a nice grade, they will say, oh, this is because I am so smart, I am so talented, because I worked so hard, I studied so hard. However, if they end up with a failed test, with a low grade, they will say, oh, this is because the test was unfair, the questions were phrased so confusingly, the teacher did such a lousy job explaining the topic, and it was a bad day, whatever. So they will refer to external circumstances instead. There are plenty more examples. A very nice one is from Rolf Dobelli from The Art of Thinking Clearly. He says we can find lots of examples for the self-serving bias if we read annual reports from companies, especially the CEO's comments. Because if the company had a great year, the CEO will usually attribute that to their brilliant decisions, tireless efforts, the great company culture they keep running, and so on. However, if the company had a bad year, well, this is due to currency fluctuations, federal governments, trade practices, tariffs, and the subdued consumer sentiment and whatnot. So we encounter the self-serving bias in a lot of areas. In the working world, the business world, we also fall prey to it ourselves. For example, we tend to believe that we get hired for a job because of our own merits, but we get fired from a job due to bad external circumstances, like lousy superiors, bad company, whatever. The same applies, of course, for a promotion or a raise I get or don't get, and many other situations. We also notice the self-serving bias in sports. Athletes tend to make this mistake if they perform great, if they have a great performance, if they win, it is due to their talent and hard work and effort. However, if they lose, it's due to the weather, the stadium, the scorekeeper, and whatnot. What are the causes of the self-serving bias? Why do we make this mistake? There are a couple of different explanations. There is an interesting study by Shepard, Malone, and Sweeney from 2008 where they explore the different explanations given in earlier research. Now, one idea that is rather obvious is that we unconsciously make this mistake in an attempt to manage our self-image. On one hand, we want self-enhancement. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want to strengthen our self-esteem. So we want to look good in front of ourselves. And on the other hand, we want a good self-presentation. We want to show ourselves in a good light, in a positive way to others. We want to seem great in front of others. So we want to emphasize our successes and we want to attribute our failures to something else. Now, this is probably an important factor. However, it's not the entire truth. Now, it might seem as if we are very careless, if we don't really approach successes and failures in an analytical way, but we actually do. We question the situations. We wonder, how did this success or this failure come to pass? What were the reasons? So we do some analyzing, but we still make the self-serving bias. And an important factor here is whether the outcome matches our expectations or not. Let's say I have applied for a job I would like to get and I am invited for an interview. Now, first of all, I obviously believe that I am qualified for the job and that I have good chances of actually getting it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have applied. I certainly plan for success, not for failure. Furthermore, I usually take specific actions in order to achieve this goal, this success. In this example, I will prepare for this interview, I will dress nicely, I will think about questions they might ask and think about answers beforehand, I will do some research about the company and so on. Now, if I end up getting an offer for the job, I will say, all right, this is as expected because I am qualified for the job and I made an effort to get it, so it's no surprise that things worked out. However, if I don't get an offer, if they don't want to hire me, I will say, wait, how did this happen? I am qualified for the job and I made an effort, but it still didn't work out. Well, something else has to be the cause. And this is where things get a bit complicated, where other biases and fallacies come into play. For example, the fact that we usually expect a positive outcome, that we are sometimes a bit over optimistic, is due to biases and fallacies. And the way I deal with evidence for whether I am actually that smart, as smart as I believe or not, that differs depending on what outcome I would have liked. It makes a difference if I ask, am I still allowed to believe that I am really smart? There I will obviously jump at the tiniest fragment of evidence. However, if I ask myself, do I really have to believe that I'm not that smart, that I'm actually rather stupid? There I will expect a large and overwhelming body of evidence before I believe that. So things get a bit complicated here, and other biases and fallacies play into the general result. Now, overall, I think the self-serving bias is actually quite understandable. However, this doesn't mean that it is harmless. Now, the first problem is, due to the self-serving bias, we might end up not learning from our mistakes. Because if I believe, oh, my failure was just due to outer circumstances, I don't have any reason to change my own behavior. If I believe, oh, I just wasn't hired for this job because the interviewer was an idiot and it was a bad day and whatever, I don't have any reason to review my documents, to rethink my preparations for the interview, so I will not improve. And the self-serving bias can also be tricky in social interactions, because if I attribute my failures to external sources, I am certainly not prone to take responsibility for them, which might lead to interpersonal problems. And it gets even worse if we think back to the fundamental attribution error that I mentioned in the beginning. In general, we tend to assume internal factors. So if my colleagues make mistakes, I will usually say, oh, this is because they are stupid, they are not qualified enough, it's their own fault. But for my own failures, I assume outer circumstances, and this doesn't fit together nicely. This is prone to lead to conflicts. At this point, I think it's important to point out that biases and fallacies, of course, are not the only factor that influences our behavior and our perception. And this is certainly the case here, because there are some people who have a very strong sense of self-efficacy, who believe they can really influence and shape their lives, they can influence their surroundings, people who believe they are in control of their lives. And on the other hand, there are people with a very low sense of self-efficacy who believe they are tossed around by fate and by outer circumstances, and whatever they experience in day-to-day life is not their own doing, but it is something that just happens to them. And of course, this makes a difference. Here we also speak of an external or internal locus of control. Now, of course, it makes a difference here if I'm someone who is able to admit their own mistakes, or if I'm someone who has a lot of trouble doing that. And it makes a difference if I'm someone who is prone to blaming themselves for everything. An important point here is Alice Boyce points out in an article in Psychology Today that people who suffer from depressions and people who have very low self-esteem, they experience a reversal of the self-serving bias. So they don't experience self-serving bias, but quite the opposite. They believe their failures are all due to their own lack of abilities, a lack of merits. This failed because I'm useless. And if they experience any successes, they attribute those to outer factors. Oh, that was just luck. That was just outer circumstances that came together to lead to a success. I didn't contribute anything to it. I'd like to talk briefly about countermeasures. Now, basically, the situation is the same as for all biases and fallacies. If I know how the self-serving bias works, I will still fall victim to it. I will still make this mistake frequently in my day-to-day lives. It's not enough to know about it. What I actually need to do is observe myself carefully, notice situations that involve success or failure, and realize, oh wait, this is a situation where I am prone to making this mistake, and then we need to carefully check our assumptions. This is pretty much the only way. However, in this specific case, I'd like to point out a thing or two. First of all, we might be inclined to think that to avoid the self-serving bias, we should be really harsh about ourselves. We should judge ourselves very harshly. Oh, there was a failure. This is probably because I'm so useless. Now, obviously, this is not a good idea. Quite the contrary is true. If I treat myself in a very empathic and compassionate way, I am less likely to fall victim to the self-serving bias, because it will help me to admit to my own mistakes, to say, well, I made a mistake. So what? It happens. It is normal. I will move on and I will learn from my mistake. And this is what's actually helpful. And furthermore, we also shouldn't be inclined to think that it is a good idea to deal with our own past mistakes extensively and excessively, to brood about all the things we did wrong in the past. Now, this is certainly not something we want to encourage, but it is something that can be part of serious problems, that can be pathological. So we should certainly avoid that. So what should we actually do? Now, one idea I'd like to give you, and please note, this is really my own idea, so it has no proven practical use. In the working world, if a project is finished successfully and if the project has good leadership, there will be some kind of retrospective at the end where all the members or the participants come together and discuss what went nicely, what went badly, what were the reasons, and what are the lessons we can learn here for our future projects. What will we do differently in the future? And I think this is something we can also use for our personal lives, for our personal projects. So after we've experienced a big success or a big failure, we should take a moment, half an hour or whatever, or an hour maybe, to sit down with a pen and a piece of paper and ask ourselves, all right, what went nicely, what went badly, what are possible reasons, both internal and external factors that contributed to this, collect all of that and consider what can we learn from this, what do we want to do different in the future. And after we finished this session, we really close the topic for ourselves. We really end brooding over it. When I checked different sources about the self-serving bias, I noticed that sometimes they don't clearly distinguish between the self-serving bias and other biases and fallacies. Usually this is not a big problem because often transitions are fluid anyway and it's a bit vague anyway. But in this case, I had the impression that it might be that it might make things more difficult to understand. Especially one example, I first encountered it in Rolf Dobelli's The Art of Thinking Clearly, but I also encountered it in other sources. Now Rolf Dobelli tells the following story. That in the building where he lives, there is an apartment rented by a group of people who live together, and he sometimes meets one of those in the floors in the staircase when they are taking out the garbage. And he always asks them, what do you think? How often do you take out the garbage? How much do you contribute to that in a percentage? And people will say, oh, well, about every second time, so about 50%, or almost always 90%, and so on. And when he added up the numbers for all those people living there, he ended up with more than 300%. And obviously it should only amount to 100%. Now, this isn't really an example for the self-serving bias, but rather for the availability bias that I presented to you a while back. Now, very briefly summarized, the availability bias is about the fact that, or deals with the fact that we will make assumptions about frequency by how easily examples come to mind, and since our own contributions are more present to us, are more on our mind than contributions of others, we will overestimate them. Now, it is a bit different. If in this situation about taking out garbage, we would experience an attribution error, it would be something like this. I would say, oh, my roommate didn't take out the trash yesterday because they are careless and messy and lazy. Today, I didn't take out the trash, but that was just because I had so much to do, I had so little time, and also it was raining outside and the trash wasn't really full anyway. So, bit different situation. And in other sources I noticed other examples that didn't really match, like all kinds of situations that merely had in common that we emphasized our own interests. And this is not what the self-serving bias is about. It really is specifically about situations where we attribute successes to our own merits and failures to outer circumstances. Finally, I'd like to say a few words about the history of those biases. This general topic of attribution biases, attribution theory, first came up in the early 20th century, and it was one Fritz Heider, a psychologist who dealt with Gestalt therapy, who brought it up. And it is still an important topic today in the field of social psychology. Well, I don't know if it is important, but at least this is where it belongs. I'd like to mention that theories concerning attribution and attribution biases, they are not uncontroversial. And one bias that belongs to this family of attribution biases was actually refuted a few years back. The so-called actor-observer bias was refuted by a meta-study by Bertram Malle in 2006. The actor-observer bias was based on the assumption that we attribute different causes depending on whether we are an outside observer or whether we are the actor ourselves. It claimed that as the observer we would attribute internal factors, internal causes, but as the actor we would attribute external factors. So for example, if I see a student who is hard at work studying, I might assume, oh, this is such a such a good student who works so hard. However, the student themselves, they might say, oh, well, I have exams coming up in 2 weeks now. Obviously, I need to study. But as I said, this actor-observer bias was refuted. Now, talking specifically about the self-serving bias, this came up in the 1960s, 1970s. It was also first brought up by Fritz Heider, and then there was an important study in 1975 by Miller and Ross. And as I understand, they also were the ones who coined this term self-serving bias. But I'm not entirely sure about that. Now, if you enjoyed the video, it's probably due to my personable appearance, my eloquent talk, and my careful research. And I think this would warrant a like and a subscription, don't you think? If you didn't enjoy the video, well, it's probably because you were distracted or didn't pay enough attention, or maybe the YouTube algorithm failed in some way, or the technical setup, I don't know. We will see each other again in the next video. For today, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.